Okay, so today we'll be looking at life at the molecular, cellular, and tissue level, but more specifically, diversity, change, and continuity. So, when we talk about diversity and change, one of our key components to making a species diverse is genetics itself. And from genetics, we get inheritance, which is directly linked to genetics in the fact that your inheritance depends on your gene pool. So we're going to be looking at genes, traits, and alleles. We're going to go over some definitions before looking at Mendel's law of inheritance. So let's get straight to it. So what is genetics? Genetics is basically the study of genetic science. So we've all heard the term genes used in our life at some point or the other. You hear people say it all the time, it's in your genes. You are this way because it's in your genes, which is not always true. We're going to look more at that now. So genetics basically attempts to explain the similarities and differences in characteristics that's displayed by a population of organisms or individuals. Population meaning a group of individuals or organisms. Now, when we look at genetics, there's two main phrases that come into play here. That's the genotype as well as the phenotype of the species. So when we talk about the genotype, it's basically the unique genetic content of the genome of an individual organism or a population of organisms of the same species. This basically means that your genotype it consists of basically how an organism is supposed to look or behave. For example, if a person has blue eyes, then the genotype of the eye of the organism must have a specific set of basically genetic makeup or coding that informs the organism that the color of the eye is going to be blue. This code or genetic makeup is something that you can't see, and it's called a genotype. It lies within the DNA of the species. Then we look at phenotype, which is basically the visible characteristic something that we can see. So the genotype produces the phenotype. So the genotype will tell the organism, okay, you're going to have blue eyes, and then the organism will produce blue eyes, and we can see the blue eyes. So the blue eye is actually your phenotype. Your genotype is basically going to look like it's basically going to look like a small b and a small b. Your other options for different colors of eyes is a capital B and a small b, or two capital Bs. So we're going to look more about how we come up with these things in another lesson. But I just want to do this to make sure that this is understood. So this means blue eyes. A capital B and a small b would mean brown eyes, and two capital Bs would also mean brown eyes. But we'll go over this a little later. So let's look at basically the structure of what we have written here. So a B and a B. So you can see it's always two. It's just two. It's either a small b and a small b, a capital B and a small b, or two capital Bs. The reason why there's only two of these alphabets, we call these alphabets alleles. So let's look more on this, right? What is an allele? But before we get to know what's an allele, it's important to know what's a genome. So a genome is basically the complete variety of hereditary DNA that an organism can have. So what this basically means is that a genome is how many different genes there can be. So for eyes, you get blue eyes, brown eyes, black. The list just goes on. There's a complete set of different ways that the genes can arrange themselves to get these sort of different phenotypes. We went over what's a genotype. So we already know what chromosomes are. Now, when we talk about autosomes, we basically think about the somatic chromosomes, but we pair them up. So how many pairs of somatic chromosomes are they? When we say somatic chromosomes, we mean bodily chromosomes, which is all your chromosomes excluding sex chromosomes. Sex chromosomes are different because there's only two. It's either male or female. So your alleles can either be male or female. Male meaning Y and female meaning X. So when we speak about autosomes, we have 22 pairs of chromosomes in a human body, which means there's 22 autosomes, because autosomes are basically the pairs of chromosomes, because we all know we get half our genes from our mother and half our genes from our father. So when these genes pair off, we end up having 22 pairs of autosomes, which means 22 pairs of bodily chromosomes. These are excluding sex cells. The main aspect of autosomes is you pairing up chromosomes, but you are also at the same time excluding sex chromosomes. The reason why sex chromosomes are looked at separately is because they are different from autosomes in that we have meiosis taking place in them, for one. For two, the cell number is different. The structure of the chromosomes is a bit different as well, and there's only two types, the X and the Y. X meaning female and Y meaning male. So we've already looked at phenotype. Traits, that's an easy one. That's the things you can see in an organism. So it's visible characteristics, your traits. So another important aspect here is a locus. The locus of a gene is a specific location of each gene in a chromosome. So it's basically a position in a chromosome that the gene will lie in, basically. And then we look at one of our main definitions here, which is an allele. An allele is a complementary set of alternative gene forms from a certain trait. So we were looking at eye color. Let's go back to our example. So here in eye color, I've already mentioned that each alphabet here, the small b or the capital B, is an allele. Let's give our little diagram here a key. So the small b would be the recessive gene, which is blue eye color in this case, and the capital B will be our dominant allele, which is in this case brown. So basically, what this sort of diagram is telling us is that there's two possible phenotypes for blue and brown eye color, but there's three different genotypes for it. So let's identify each genotype and phenotype. So I'm just going to write it below here. The genotypes of these eye colors are basically small b, capital B, small b, and then capital B, capital B. But our phenotypes are just the two, blue and brown. Of course, there are many different eye colors, but in this example, we wanted to keep it simple. So we just looked at the blue eye color and the brown eye color. Now the same can be done for height of an organism. Let's look at that, height of an organism. So an organism can either be tall or short, right? So we already know our phenotype can either be tall or short. You can't have somebody who's both tall and short. That doesn't happen. So let's go and look at our genotypes. Okay, but first let's have our little key again. So in this instance, I'm going to let capital T be tall, and little t is going to be, now it's little t, it's going to be short. So our genotypes now can be capital T, then we're going to have capital T, small t, and then you're going to wonder why in the previous option I didn't include something that goes small b, capital B. The reason for this is because when organisms arrange themselves, so if it's going to be little t, big T, we can clearly see that these two are sort of the same. These two, they're basically the same thing. One capital T and one little t. So what happens in an organism is, this is going into Mendel's law now. So what happens in the organism is, because there's both the gene for tallness as well as the gene for shortness, the organism detects both but orders it such where the dominant gene takes over. The dominant gene, dominant allele. The dominant allele is always the allele with the capital letter, which in this case is tallness. The recessive gene is represented by a lowercase alphabet, which in this case is little t for shortness. If you're feeling a bit confused at this point, don't stress too much. We're going to go over many more examples on this in the future. So basically, from here, we see that these two are basically the same thing. So this little t, capital T, is going to rearrange itself to form this capital T, little t. So we're just going to delete this. And our last genotype will be little t, little t. Now, the problem comes in when we have to allocate the genotype and phenotype to each other. So let's look at how these genotype, like what phenotype is brought about by each genotype. So we'll start with the capital T, capital T. Capital T means tall. The second capital T also means tall. So this person is going to be a tall person. Then we get into capital T, small t. This is basically one allele for tallness and the second allele, which is a little t, for shortness. So there's an allele for tallness as well as an allele for shortness. But we've already established that the allele for tallness is dominant over the allele for shortness. So this person's going to be tall. Then if we want to look at the other type that we just discussed now, little t, big T, which we will be looking at more in the future. So here, once again, there's an allele for shortness as well as an allele for tallness. So what happens in this genotype is, the allele for tallness is dominant, so it masks the effect of the allele for shortness. So it's basically the fact that both alleles cannot be dominant at the same time. They both cannot show their phenotypes at the same time, because how can a person be both short and tall? It's not possible. So what happens is, the dominant allele, which is the allele for tallness, capital T, masks the effect of the recessive allele, which is little t, for shortness. So this person, once again, is going to be tall. And then we get little t, which little t is the allele for shortness. So both alleles are for shortness. So the person is going to have to be short. Okay, so a few notes just to recap or make things a bit simpler. Okay, so basically, firstly, a phenotype, when we think of a phenotype, the question we ask is, what do I see? A phenotype is something you can pick out, something you can see in an organism. A genotype, on the other hand, is the genetic coding for what I'm seeing. This is something I cannot see. It's within the organism. It's within the chromosomes of this organism. Then we look at alleles. Each genotype is made of two alleles, and there are two types of allele, a dominant allele and a recessive allele. So a dominant allele is represented by a capital letter, as we've seen here, capital T for tallness or capital B for brown eyes. It masks, a dominant allele will mask the effect of a recessive allele, and it is the trait that you will see in the phenotype of an organism. A recessive allele is represented by a lowercase alphabet, so little b and little t.